So this is the last lecture from me. I've talked about vulnerability to climate change in small island states. I've discussed the way adaptation can work and what it might be able to achieve, but explained that nevertheless mitigation is very important, and then talked about the regime, the Climate Change Convention, and the extent to which it has and can achieve reductions in emissions. One of the arguments that I've sought to develop through this week has been about thinking about this problem of greenhouse gas emissions and controlling greenhouse gas emissions as being something more than simply countries do, a different kind of geographic imagination of the world. And I want to explain this a bit more today. Let me make my points or summarise this week's lectures in a fairly unconventional way. Let's just say it's the mid-1980s and I have a great deal of power in the world and I'm opposed to climate change. How might I go about setting up the discussion in the institutions to deal with this problem to make sure that nothing ever happened? Well, I'd do 5 things to make sure we never did anything about climate change. First of all, I'd make sure that the problem was always described as uncertain and maybe, just maybe, it's not necessary, so that whenever push comes to the shove, people could cognitively retreat to this idea that, oh, that looks like it might be hard, maybe we don't need to do it because maybe it's not really a problem. And so this injection of uncertainty all the time is a really good way of making sure maybe this issue isn't as important as we think it is. And I'd certainly go about ensuring and investing in groups and supporting people to attack the science all the time, to create doubt about the scientific recognition of this problem, to make sure that it's continually uncertain, continually doubtful in the minds of the public and decision makers. Secondly, I'd want climate change to be understood as being an environmental problem. It's a problem for fluffy things that live in ecological margins, for polar bears and for species, but it's not really a social problem. And when social issues are raised, if somebody says, well, it is actually a social problem, so it has development implications, I'd certainly want it to be understood that those implications fall on people who live in poor countries, who don't have much power in world affairs, who won't bear the cost of reducing emissions. So that people in developed countries can think, well, if this is a social problem, it's not my social problem, it's not a problem for my society, it's a problem for those poor people out there in the world that I generally don't have to think about, don't have to face. And so that climate change would only be as effective as efforts to solve global poverty, which typically are not particularly effective. So if the world's already destitute, then what's a little bit more destitution because of climate change? So making sure this is always an environmental problem means that it's in some ways a less important problem than it really is. The third thing I'd do was make it known that the cost of solving this problem are very high and will fall disproportionately on rich people living in the world's wealthiest countries. So that it becomes a problem in a sense of people in rich countries incurring costs seem to be a problem, but people in rich countries incurring costs to save species about which they might not particularly care, or save people about whom they might not particularly care. And I'd calculate those costs always in terms of aggregate dollars, the amount of money that is lost, rather than representing them in terms of what they really are, which is slight reductions in projected rates of GDP growth. What's really involved in the cost of reducing emissions is potentially a slight slowing of growth, but growth nonetheless in developed countries. Finally, I'd propagate the idea that the best way of solving this problem would be through a treaty amongst all countries, that we won't do anything until every country in the world agrees collectively and in consensus that something is to be done. And I'd ensure, like most international regimes, that the rules about decision making are unclear, that every country is required to commit to a decision, including carbon superpowers like the USA and China, oil exporters like Saudi Arabia, and highly vulnerable countries like Bangladesh or small island states. I'd ensure that this climate change regime doesn't meet very often, that is designed and run by lawyers, that small countries don't have much capacity to influence it, and again require that only full agreement is a precondition of countries, is a precondition for reducing emissions. So push this into a regime cul-de-sac and wait. And I'd propagate this idea in all the rich countries of the world that we don't have to do anything domestically as a country or as individuals until the international community agrees to act collectively, until this regime that can never reach consensus and never really reaches agreement, we can just wait. So this gives everybody who consumes things, and every firm that consumes things, and everybody who produces an action that reduces emissions of greenhouse gases to do nothing and to disassociate themselves from some degree from this problem, because it's uncertain, because it's an environmental problem, because if it does affect people, it affects poor people who are over there, because actually it might be really expensive. We might incur a lot of cost to solve this problem that isn't our problem in developed countries, and it maybe doesn't exist anyway. And anyway, we'll wait for the International Convention to send us a signal that says, yes, the world has decided to universally act, we all agree, and now countries, you have to go. And in this way, we end up with no significant action. We end up with people who are living lives and firms who are producing things and countries who are producing large amount of greenhouse gas emissions, not really doing anything about it. Maybe we don't need to. Maybe it's not our problem. We'll wait for the regime. So we're all excused. We're all waiting for somebody to tell us what to do, and it's never going to happen. Now, I'm not being facetious. This isn't some plan that somebody had, but it is effectively the situation that we have. But it's important to stay positive. There are all sorts of things going on in the world that give us cause for hope. The alliance of cities who are significantly reducing their greenhouse gas emissions is really positive. The role of states within countries, of provinces and states within countries acting to significantly reduce their emissions despite what their national governments are doing is really positive. The way shareholders are beginning to make decisions and influence decisions in large publicly listed companies to ensure that they reduce their emissions is positive. Where I live, there's been a massive expansion in solar photovoltaic cells on houses that's significantly reducing emissions across the energy sector in my economy. In fact, despite this situation, there is a demand for change, and change is slowly coming. Some people and some institutions have stopped waiting for the convention. Some people and some institutions understand this is a real problem. This is our problem, it's everyone's problem, and we're not going to wait for our governments. And we can take action, and we can begin to reduce our emissions in ways that don't impose costs on us and in fact are beneficial for us. So there's slow change at the grassroots. It's happening progressively, and that's a really positive phenomenon. It's not enough, but it's happening. And if you look at this change that's happening, it's not really happening in many places because national governments have decided they'll do something. It's happening because people are acting anyway. And this comes back to this argument I want to make about thinking quite differently about the geopolitics of greenhouse gas emissions, and not thinking about the world of sovereign states, of black boxes on a map of the world, but thinking about what really produces emissions and who really does it. And in the first take of this, thinking about the geopolitics of emissions, we at least need to get past this idea that climate change is a problem between the north, the rich countries, and the south, the poor countries. There are some very wealthy, large greenhouse gas producing countries in the south. Singapore, Korea, industrialising economies, China, who are producing large amounts of emissions, and who many people in China, there's hundreds of millions of wealthy upper middle class people in China, who are not poor, whose right to develop has generally been met, who still produce large amounts of emissions, and who are no less responsible now for reducing their emissions than the rich countries in the north. By the same token, in the rich countries in the north, there are all sorts of disadvantaged low-income groups who produce very few emissions and who require different sorts of treatment under emissions reductions efforts than wealthy individuals. And we just need to get beyond countries altogether, perhaps to some degree, and thinking about who produces things and the countries that produce them, but also think about who consumes things. The cost of our own consumption of products manufactured in other countries is a really important issue. We can't deny this responsibility, those of us who consume lots of things, that the consumption that we have, we are responsible for the emissions associated with that, even if they're credited against the country in which they're manufactured. In reality, we demand these things. When we consume them, we have to accept some responsibility for them, and maybe we need to accept that we have to pay a bit more for them to ensure that they're produced in cleaner ways. Maybe we need to expect that there's a tax on the border of the import of that commodity that we consume, that taxes it for its carbon content, and we'll pay that tax in order to have the things we have in a more sustainable way. And thinking about regions, thinking about parts of the world within developed and developing countries that have quite different levels of wealth is also very important. It's a problem of class. Paul Bayers produced some interesting statistics some years ago about this that I think are really revealing, that the wealthiest 10% of people in the developed countries emit 7.5 times more greenhouse gas emissions than the poorest 10% of people in their own countries. That's absolutely true in Australia where I live. There would be remote populations, remote indigenous populations, whose emissions of greenhouse gas emissions are a very small fraction of people living high energy consuming lifestyles in the major cities in Australia. Look at the consumption and the production of emissions of the wealthiest 10% of people in the developed countries and compare it to the poorest 10% of people in developing countries, and you can see that a rich person in a country like the United States or Canada or Australia or Europe emits over 150 times more emissions than a poor person in a country like Ethiopia or Tuvalu. Rich people produce more emissions, and it's perhaps about individuals and about class much more than it is about countries if we really want to target action at the place where emissions happen. And this is an interesting question. So what, in the Framework Convention of Climate Change, the negotiators often for the developing countries are people from upper classes. They're quite wealthy people advocating on behalf of the poor in their own countries and advocating on behalf of their own economies. I have followed climate change negotiators from low-income states who have spent 2 weeks arguing, you know, the rights of the poor, we need to protect the rights of our poor to reduce emissions, while they've walked onto the plane and turned left and walked into business class. And it just makes one think about whose really interests are being argued for here, for the poor or for the rich people who live in poor countries and the rich people who live in rich countries. And it might not only be the rich countries who are comforted by inaction on climate change, it might also be the rich people in poor countries who also don't really, or no more, want emissions or constraints on their consumption or higher costs of consumption in developing countries than people in rich countries do. The poor actually don't have a lot of voice and self-representation in the Framework Convention of Climate Change, and it might be quite an interesting process if they did. Imposing reductions on countries is an interesting thing to do. That's certainly the way we organise the international system, and it's been that way for a long time. It's not proving to be particularly effective. The two-level game means that not every country has a domestic imperative to reduce their emissions, and even if they do, countries where there is demand for reducing emissions don't necessarily reduce their emissions anyway. Democratic governments are not necessarily particularly responsive to the demands of their electorates, in particular on the issue of climate change. Countries themselves, the apparatus of government, don't emit very much. We impose the targets on countries on the assumption that they will accept the responsibility to affect policies and processes within their countries that will reduce emissions, if they choose to do so. So what we're really doing when we're imposing emissions reductions targets on countries who are represented by their governments is expecting them then to create policies and measures that regulate the behaviour of consumers and firms within their economies. It's an important difference. To say that my government of Australia has an emissions reductions target is really to say we are expecting you to implement that target across your economy and to get involved with those activities that are producing emissions in your economies. Now, that's easier said than done. Many governments don't wish to do that, and certainly many people in those economies don't wish to see it happen. So there's a question here that can states control firms? To what extent do they do this now? It's long, the days where governments in liberal democratic economies had very strong regulatory powers over enterprises within their economies are long gone. The degree to which a government can control the actions of its firms is potentially quite limited. I'm asking the question, to what extent can states really control firms? To what extent can states control the behaviours of their people? To what extent can a government say, this household Y, we require you to have a number of solar panels, one vehicle, and so on and so forth? But there's a social regulation here, there's a social licence that's required. If governments are going to be effective in controlling firms, if governments are going to be effective in controlling the emissions of individuals, firms and individuals to some degree have to want that to happen too, otherwise governments won't get elected and they won't do it. So it goes the other way too. If people really want their governments to reduce emissions, effectively saying we would like you to intervene in the economy, to regulate, to create carbon taxes or emissions trading schemes, government, we expect you to do that, and if you don't, we won't vote you in again. To what extent does the public have control over their governments, conversely? And perhaps even more importantly, if governments can't control firms, to what extent can the public control the behaviour of firms? Will they boycott certain oil companies? Will they choose not to consume things that have been produced that have high emissions content? Will they invest their shares differently in different firms according to their behaviours? Will they take over the boards? Will they lobby at meetings of shareholders and so on? To what extent do people really seek also to control the firms that are producing things in their economies, let alone the firms that are producing things in other people's economies that they consume? It's a complicated world. Economic interdependence, multinational corporations, governments that are reluctant and potentially losing their power to regulate the behaviour of firms, governments that are perhaps not so responsive to electorates anymore, electorates that are perhaps not so interested in controlling their governments, and certainly perhaps not too interested in controlling their firms. These are the kinds of conversations that I think are required if we're really seriously going to reduce our emissions. These are the kinds of levels of action, of political action and economic action that are going to be required if we're going to seriously reduce our emissions. They're going to be required in the developed and developing economies that produce large amounts of emissions, and they impose responsibilities on people in those economies to think and act differently, to not run away from this problem, to not deny its existence, to not wait for the convention. If we're moral individuals and we're ethical individuals, we need to have a concern for other people, we need to have a concern for future generations, and we need to have a concern about what we buy and how we vote and how we talk to each other. So it's a world really not just of countries. That's a very simple, crude, black and white drawing of the geopolitics of carbon. It's a world of consumers, it's a world of shareholders, it's a world of voters. The need for rapid and deep cuts in emissions makes the UNFCCC process look really slow and really cumbersome. Action on climate change, on reducing emissions, can't wait for the convention. It is very unlikely to deliver. What's required is action that is consistent with the convention. The convention needs to continue and do what it does, but people who are engaging in behaviours that increase emissions of greenhouse gas emissions at all sorts of different levels of social organisation in all sorts of different spheres need to go beyond this and do more. It's about how we act as individuals, particularly those of us in the rich economies whose lifestyles and behaviours cause increasing emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. A different way of thinking about the world, and a way in which we can situate ourselves to be moral and responsible actors if we choose to behave in these ways. All of which is to say, this isn't an international political problem, it's an everyday political problem that comes back into what we do when we get out of bed and how we live our own lives. And the solution to this problem is going to occur through actions at that kind of level, not just through actions at the international level.